How's it going, guys? We got the camera back this time. What else do we got? We got part 8 of this series. We're going to be talking about for loops and while loops in this series. In this part of the series. Now, if for those of you who don't know what a loop does, well, a loop just goes through element by element on certain data types that's given to us by Python. And these data types include lists, tuples, dictionaries, strings, and so on. You may ask, why is it useful? Why do we need to go through element by element for each of these data types that's given by Python? Well, take an example. If you had a list of usernames, right? You're running a website and you had a list of usernames and you wanted to remove any username that had profanities in it. You're not going to manually check every single thing in this, every single username on this list and remove it, manually. You may want to automate it by using a loop. You want to go through each of these elements and maybe add an if statement to say, let's go through this 10,000 list of usernames and we're going to remove any username that has, the words beep, another word of beep, mother beep, So that's just one of many examples of using a for loop and while loop, but it's fundamental in programming. So to get started, let's figure out how to write one. Before I write one, I'm gonna have my things to iterate through. So we have a list here, a tuple here, okay, a dictionary here, and a string here. I'm going to suggest the playlist. If you're not the playlist to know all these different data types if you don't know these data types, I have a playlist talking about each of these data types and how to work with them. And I'll have it suggested right in the corner or somewhere here. Okay. Now we have a list, a tuple, and let's just call this a string. Okay. There are more things that you can iterate through, but I'm just giving these examples. You can also iterate through a set. Okay. And every single time I say iterate, all we're doing is going through a list or a tuple or a dictionary element by element. That's all iterating means. So let's start looping. First thing we're gonna do is try to show how to how to actually loop something, how it looks like in Python, right? So we're gonna have a loop. We're gonna start with a loop called for loop, okay? And the syntax goes something like this. So you see how this is red, so because this is a keyword in Python, okay? So we write for, and then we're gonna say item here, okay? And then we're gonna say in a list. Okay, so what this means is for each item, you can name this whatever you want. Notice that it's white, which means we can name it whatever you want. I just named it item. For item in a list, okay? So, and we have a colon. So a list, this part is where we enter in our variable name for the variable that we picked. In this case, it's a list, and the name is called a list. And if I printed out item, so remember I said that item is each of these elements that we're iterating through, and after the in keyword, we're gonna have that the actual variable we're iterating through. Okay, so if I did for each item in a list colon, we're gonna have a block of code down here, right? They could have, as long as it's indented, you can have many lines of code here, okay? And in this case, we're gonna repeat this 3 times because we have 3 elements. So in the first for loop, the item is gonna turn into the string ice because we're iterating element by element. In the second loop, item's gonna turn into water, and in the third loop, we're gonna have the element gas, and then it finally finishes. Okay, so a for loop always goes through the length amount of times of that variable. Okay, all of these have a length of 3, right? Because each of them are separated by commas. And on each of those loops, we're going to be working with a single element, and it's the whatever loop we're in. That's the element we're going to be working with. So if I'm on the second loop, we're going to be working on this with the second element. You can imagine this is going to print out ice, water, gas on 3 different occasions, 3 different loops, and this is as expected. Okay. So like I said, this could be any variable that you created. It could even be the array. You can even just, not the array, you can even put in a list yourself. This does the same exact thing because a list is just what I declared it to be. I can say a dictionary. Okay. A dictionary is a little bit more tricky, but when when I say item in this case is the key. So this is going to print out 1, 2, 3, the integers. And I'll get into that in a second. And we got a tuple. Okay, this would say ice, water, gas, and finally a string. Each of these, remember, you can technically loop through a string by elements because each is a character. So instead of an element looking thing like this for a list or a tuple or a dictionary, we have characters. We're looping through characters. So you can see this will print out ICE. Okay. To go back on what I said about dictionaries, dictionary is the only odd one out, and usually people like to call, instead of item, we call it key, because remember we said in our dictionary tutorial that we have key : value, right? That's what people call it in Python, and hence the reason why I printed out the keys instead of the values when we were looping through it. So in order to get the values is very intuitive. We have our dictionary. Okay, how do we access our values? Well, we have our dictionary, which we're looping through, and then we type in the key, right? On the first loop, key is going to be 1, and a dictionary with the key 1 is going to give us back the string 1. Second loop, same idea with integer 2 as the key and string of 2 as the value, and the same thing goes for 3. Okay, now if I printed this, you'll see that it's 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so remember, we have the for keyword, and then this is whatever you want to name it. This is but once you name it like that, that's where once you pick a certain name, that is what you're going to use to refer to the single element depending on the loop we're in, and this is the actual variable that we're looping through. Okay, and you can't loop through integers because it just doesn't make sense. There's nothing to loop through for integers. Same with floats. So it's usually just the ones I've listed here plus sets and whatever else Python allows you to loop through. Okay. Now, like we learned in the last tutorial, we have things called if and else. So in a for loop, remember when it's indented, all it is just a block of code. So if I wanted to, I can actually say, I can actually add an if else statement. Okay, so I can say if, let's just say I wanted to print the word. So I wanted to print the word of the integer. So if, let's say I wanted to print the word 2, that means I will only print it if the key is equal to the value 2. Else, okay, remember we can just say pass just does nothing. Okay, we can see that it prints 2 because when it was 1, it says key is not 1, so we just pass. When it was 3, it says key is not 2, we pass because key is 3. But when key was 2, we get to print the value of the string 2 because key was 2. So you can put whatever code you want here, right? It builds onto everything that we've learned before. In certain cases, we won't be able to see in this tutorial, but it's important to know that there are two keywords that you can use that are provided by Python that you can use in a for loop. Those are called break and continue. Now, break is useful for when you want to just stop the loop for whatever reason at a certain loop that you want to stop. So, for example, if I wanted to, for whatever reason, break the loop if I wanted to stop the loop. So first of all, for this loop, we're gonna print out the key, and when the key is 2, we're gonna break. Okay, so this should be up here. Okay, so it's gonna go through 1 as the key, and it says it's not equal to 2, so we don't break yet, and we say that the key is equal. That's why you print the key of 1. Then we check if the key is equal to 2. It is equal to 2, then we break. So break just stops the for loop. It does not loop through the total number of elements times anymore. Right? In this case, it's 3. It just stops after the second one, and you can put break anywhere. Okay, that's what break does. And another good use case for break is when you run yourself into an infinite loop, which will we might see in the while loop in a bit. Okay. And another keyword that I said is called continue. Well, continue. What continue does is instead of stopping the loop entirely, it skips that element that we're on. Right. So key, we have 1, 2, or 3 as integers. We loop through 3 times. For here, we're saying if key equals to 2, we're gonna skip that iteration, okay? And we're gonna continue with 3, okay? So in this case, it's gonna check with 1. Key is not equal to 1, so we print a key of 1. Now we go on to the next key. The next key is 2. Yes, the key is 2, and we say continue. So we skip on to the next iteration, and everything down here just gets disregarded, right? The moment we have continue. And if it was break, we would stop the loop completely, but if it was continue, we just stop that specific iteration. So if I were to run this, we should have 1 and 3, which is what we have here. So that's what continue and break does. For when we have if else in the last part, for loops, we also have an alternative option called else. Okay, and really all this does is after you loop through whatever you want to loop through, so in this case it's 3 times, we got 3 elements in dictionary. Once it's done, we're gonna do this. We're gonna have a block of code that we're gonna run after the else. Okay, so it's gonna go through this loop 3 times, and then it's gonna go to the else statement. So remember, else can tag along with if, but it can also tag along with for, okay? And for the for loop, we loop through this 3 times, and once it was done, we jump into the else loop, and then we do whatever code we want to do here, okay? In certain scenarios, we'd like our loop to just be empty. It's weird to think about that, but once you get into programming, it's a very possible thing to do. But you can't exactly type nothing in it, right? Just because you don't want the loop to do anything doesn't mean you can leave it as empty, okay? It just says you know, it's throwing an error. So just like in if else, we can use the same keyword called pass, which is just a placeholder for when a for loop goes empty. A pass does absolutely nothing, but just make sure you're not going to throw an error when your for loop is empty. Okay. Finally, we may want to, very common with algorithm questions, is to loop through a list. Have a nested loop. Okay, so what does that mean? So let's just say I have for list item in a list. Okay, and we have, so this is a loop. We're looping through 3 times here because we have 3 things in this list, and then we say in this for loop we're going to have another for loop called a tuple with each element called a tuple, and we're going to loop through tuple item. So, and let's just say we wanted to print list item and tuple item on every loop. So a nested loop means there's another for loop in the outer for loop. So there's an inner for loop and an outer for loop, and it's gonna loop whatever this variable's length is times whatever this variable's length is. So in this case, it's gonna loop through 9 times. Why? Well, on the first element, we're going to have ice as substituted for a list element for the first outer loop. And when we get into the inner loop, we're going to loop through 3 times through ice, water, gas, while list item stays as ice. Okay, so list item stays as ice, and tuple item, and for a tuple, we're going to iterate through ice, water, and gas. Once the inner loop is done, then we go back to the outer loop again, and we have water as our list item, and again we jump back into our inner loop, and we have tuple item as ice, water, and gas. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Going through what I just said, right? You see that the first word, and you see how the first word is repeated 3 times, and it changes after 3 lines, and that's because this is a list. This is a list item, this is a list item, there's a tuple, a tuple, a tuple. This is the second list item in a list, and this is this third list item in a list. And these are the inner loop tuple items. If I confused you more here, I'm very sorry. Hopefully I can explain it better next time. So, the last thing I want to talk about with loops is a thing called while loops. There's a lot to learn about while loops, but I'm just going to cover the very basics here. A while loop does a similar thing to a for loop, but it loops on different conditions, right? For a for loop, the condition is we're going to loop until the list is done. For a while loop, you have a lot of freedom, and the syntax goes something like this, okay? So let's just say we initialize some I to be 0, okay? We're going to have the keyword while, and then we're going to have some boolean here, okay? So we can say true is a boolean, false is a boolean, I equals 3 is also a boolean, okay? So let's just say while I is less than 3. So the block of code under this is going to loop until I is equal or greater than 3, right? We're only going to keep looping if I is less than 3, okay? So let's just say if I wanted to loop through, remember that we can loop through a list by accessing its indexes. So in this case, it's I, and then we say I is going to be equal to I plus 1. So I starts at 0. We're gonna on the first loop we're gonna print a list as a list of 0. So we're gonna print ice, and then we're gonna add I plus 1, and then we're gonna go through it again. I equals 1. 1 is still less than 3, so we're gonna print water. Go back. Now I is less than 2. 2 is still less than 3, so we can see that it prints everything here. But if I did 2 here, then it would only print ice and water, because I would only ever achieve 0 and 1. Because on the third loop, I is equal to 2, and it checks this boolean. This is false, right? 2 is not less than 2, that's why it just stops. So if I ran this, we can see that this is ice equals water. I forgot to talk about one more thing, so I'm gonna add it into here. There's a thing called range, and just to show that what it does. So we have range, and range takes in a number, okay? And let's just length, right? Length, this is going to come back as 3 as we've seen before, because the list has a length. This list that we have here has a length of 3. And then we're going to have the range of this number, okay? And then let's just see what it does. Well, we have an object called range 03. I'm going to show why this is useful. Let's just say we have length is equal to the range of, so length is going to equal to this, which is exactly range 0 to 3. Why this is useful is because we can actually loop through this. And it's a different way to loop through data types like list, right? Remember list, we can iterate through them with indexes. And in the for loops, the way that we used for loops before, we're iterating by element. But now with this, we can actually iterate through by numbers, okay? So length is an object called range 03. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to loop from 0 up until the second last number that is shown here. Okay, so this is what length is, and it's going to allow us to start at the first number that's shown here up until the second last number that's shown here. So 3 minus 1, which is 0, 1, 2, right? Why is this useful? Well, we can do stuff like this. Okay, we can access the list instead of just saying by item. Now we're accessing it by its index, and this does the same thing as the for loop that we did before. This also works with tuples. Okay. Now we have a little bit more freedom on what another way on what to show, on what to do in a for loop, because we can say if I equals, let's say 2, okay? If the index is 2, that's the only time you're gonna give me back the elements. You wouldn't be able to do this with a for loop that doesn't use range, okay? There is an error here because it should be an equal, and you can see that a list with the index 2 is gas, and that's the only one printed on the screen. That is all the basic essentials that you need to know about for loops and while loops. If you liked this series, you can follow, you can subscribe, like the video. You know, if I made any errors, please let me know down in the comments. And I hope to see you in the next part.